Today I want to continue the discussion started in my video Drawing for Concept Art, where I put together 52 tutorials talking about construction in perspective, design, environments, vehicles, and all of that. So if you haven't seen that, the link's going to be in the description. But today I want to talk about values and going from all the way from casting shadows to understanding lighting and above all, controlling values. I think that's the hardest part and the one that will take longer, and to which, to be honest, I never got to a point where I was comfortable with values, and I'm going to discuss that later on in the video. You can follow the numbers for all the reference I'm going to be using here today in the description. It's not supposed to be a follow-through list, one after the other. It's just for a reference so that you can find easier all the tutorials and books and time lapses and all of that. So some of them are going to be a sequence, some of them are not, and I'm going to talk about that throughout the video. So we start with how to render and frame perspective 2. Both of them discuss pretty in depth the casting of shadows. Specifically, how to render has a lot of videos covering the topics that will also cover some of the tutorials that I have here from the foundation group. So you definitely can go a long way just with how to render book. You don't need frame perspective. It's just in addition, and you can also learn from the amazing content on perspective for the figure. So jumping from that to tutorials to really visualize what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, understanding geoforms, simple forms so that you can understand casting shadows and how value and light drops into a simple surface. So understanding spheres and reflected light. We talked a little bit about that in my video on color and light book. James Gurney also goes in depth into that. But here, lights are going to be changing direction. So you can see here in the small thumbnails, different lighting situations so that you can understand what changes if the light is closer to the objects or far away, and different scenarios for you to study. Once you get the primitives, it's almost like drawing in dynamic sketching. Once you get the primitives, you go to compound geoforms. So you start changing the primitives, combining them, subtracting from them, and casting shadows and understanding the variations in the values inside each object, especially if they have a local color or local value in this case, that is different from white. So from white to black, there will also be a lot of change into how the light interacts. And Scott Robertson has a great framework for that. He uses a halfway to black concept where you get the local value and the light and understand where that will fall in that scale. And different lights, different strengths of light will definitely influence the final result. Once you get those, you can start pretty much building real things. So here, a simplified tank and casting shadows of that as well, and different values inside that object. So you have different materials. We've seen the example from James Gurney's checkerboard. He doesn't use exactly this one that I found on the internet, but he uses a checkerboard just to show that your darkest value in the light can be equal to your lightest value in the dark, in the shadow area. So understanding that this is one value, it's very hard and very hard to grasp when you're looking to the world. And we'll discuss a little bit the separation from that. Andrew Loomis has a great book, Creative Illustration, that talks about that. And he divides in a way that the darkest point in the light area is always lighter than the brightest point in the shadow area. So you have a separation on the range of values so that readability don't causes this kind of confusion. So going back to the tutorials, Scott Robertson also has a little bit of a checkerboard in how to render book. So you will have all the information in there as well. But this is where it starts to get harder to control value ranges and understand the different variations you have, and we'll get way deeper later on. So intro to brush pen. I love this tutorial, simple tutorials from John Paick. So you're getting to way more complex volumes, even organic shapes with primates and later on figures, but you're simplifying two value compositions and casting of shadows so that you go from primitives first and understand the concepts and then apply them later on. So it's going to be great to continue the discussion that I was saying just now. If you want to separate the ranges from light to dark, it's great to understand where it will be shadow and where it will be light. So this kind of exercises, and it continues here with more complex forms, as well as this tutorial from his own Gumroad page with way more complex scenes and organic shapes. If you have a grasp of that, you will go a long way into the separation and readability of your designs later on. Combining everything that we just said, we go back to primitives again. So it's always great to keep coming back to simple and then getting more complex with environments. So this is a great tutorial. I love this. There is also one in John Paick's Gumroad page as well, so you can check that out. But here he goes really in depth into casting shadows, understanding complex surfaces, and how to present it in a very interesting way. So here, the variations of value inside the shadow area will go a long way into giving details and textures, but also you need a very clear separation with the rest of the image to have a pleasing composition. So it's getting more and more complex. The next one goes into object rendering with textures and real textures. This is almost like a matte surface to some extent, as we were always talking about matte surfaces in most of them. And the ones that we didn't, that were more complex, we simplified them. And now we get to a point where textures are going to be really important and materials will have a difference. So you have something like this coffee mug that is more shiny. You will need to convey that with the highlights and the different reflections and all of that, as well as the cube here will have a lot of different values inside that, and peeling, painting in some of the surfaces and so on. This one is an interesting one for those that want to go more in a traditional route. So using markers to simplify metallic objects as well. So you will need all the primitives that we've been discussing so far, but go way beyond in simplifying, as you don't have the full range of values when you're dealing with markers. You can go in with a pencil later on and grow the range of values, and there is even a discussion in how to render about that using different materials. But here you will really definitely need to simplify, and that is also important, just as we saw with simplifying light and shadow. How can you convey with lesser values the same material so that later on you don't need to render everything realistic? Once we get that, we move ahead to the basic rendering continued from Charles Lin. So way more complex surfaces, metallic surfaces, reflections, highlights, different local values, a range of way more difficult topics for us to tackle. But in the end of the day, we'll need to simplify so we have readability. So always have that in mind. Continue on. I love this book and controlling values with hatching and all of that. I've discussed Zorn in some of my videos as well. He uses cross hatching and really controls values. So trying to control values in different materials will also go a long way into understanding and have a better grasp of what you're doing. The next one is more of a controlling blending shapes. So you're going to use Photoshop to really try and change lighting situations in an environment that is more of a window lighting, and then you will give direction to that. That is also really interesting to understand lighting direction, as we were saying before, casting shadows, the intensity of that light source, and how that will influence the overall environment with reflected lights and so on. So if you have a situation where there is only a small area in the light, and we've seen painting by Sargent in one of my videos discussing beauty in painting in the ordinary. The link is going to be in the description as well. So really controlling this and how that will affect the overall environment also goes a long way. And we're compounding as before, getting more and more complex with different local values, different materials, and so on. That done, we can start getting more creative and relighting a screenshot from a movie, for example, changing situations. This is really important in the animation industry, where you will do overpainting of 3D scenes, sometimes in value, sometimes in color, as well as in the video game industry. So creating keyframes for games like Uncharted. A lot of times you'll get a level design block out. I've discussed that in the video on James Paick's work, and we'll get to James Paick later on in this video as well. But understanding that you get a 3D block out and you need to convey what the lighting and the mood that we're going to have for that scene, everything that we're been discussing until this point will be really valuable. Creative illustration goes in a traditional route again. So we get back to frame techniques, frame drawing techniques as well. But Loomis goes really deep into that separation concept of the ranges of light, as well as different configurations where in this tutorial by Kalen Chock as well discusses this. If you have darker value in front of lighter values, and if you change that and you have the lighter values in the front and the darker values in the back, how that will change the composition. So it starts going into more of a composition mindset than only controlling your lights and your values. Now you're intentionally changing the configuration to set up the mood that you want. So here you have only the silhouette of the lighthouse, and here you have more readability of the foreground elements. So everything that we've seen so far will combine into more and more complex environments, especially when you're out in the sunlight, how that will change from artificial light. James Gurney also goes into that in his book. So really important. So you can get creating your environments and really understand and go a long way with the lighting. That will get harder and harder, so take one step at a time. We also can go into figure drawing. So I love this shading course by Dorian Iten. It's on Proko's website, so you can definitely check that out. But Lixin Yin, I don't know if I'm butchering the name, but it's a great concept artist and painter. Also has tutorials on Foundation talking about portraits. Bobby Chu and Thomas Fluharty discuss the sketching, simplified sketching with values, both for animals and a diverse range of topics. at Schoolism. And then it gets, as we said before, harder and harder. Some examples here from Steven Zapata. So we are thinking again of cylinders. If we can simplify those structures to cylinders, we are using some of the concepts that we used from the primitives, but getting way, way more complex. If we remember the discussion on drawing, that's the same case. If you're drawing figures, you can simplify for primitives, but it will get harder and harder. I love this drawing by Carla Ortiz. There is also a time lapse for this. The link is going to be in the description. This is where it gets really, really hard to control values and what's in light, what's in shadow, how to control the overall readability, where you want to lead the eye. So it's getting very, very complex, as it was getting with the environments. Now you really need to have control of what you're doing, and it's going to be always a learning curve, but you get more and more control. Miles Johnston is also a great reference on pencil drawing, graphite drawing, as well as Nathan Fowkes with charcoal. I love where he takes things off and from the details and simplifies. So we get back to the discussion in the brush pen tutorials, where you need to simplify to have readability. It's the same here with Carla, it's the same with Steven and Miles. They need to simplify some stuff. You don't want all the details in there, all the value variations in there, because it can get confusing. Going into digital, also Anthony Jones is a great resource for that. But in the character realm and in the environment realm, I really love James Paick's work. And if we look at this painting by him, we can see that everything that we discussed so far is used here. And we can also use that to review some of the points. So you have primitives here. So you have a lot of spheres, you have cylinders, you have squares, cylinders in here. You have different, a light source that is cut by shadow areas. So just a small part of the scene is in full blown light. So how will that affect reflected light in all the other surfaces? How can you separate what's in shadow from what's in light and what has reflected light? So you have readability. So this area, full area of shadow, is very, very readable and comes to the foreground. Also, you have different materials. So you have more of a metallic highlights back here, as well as the floor is very reflective. You have a little bit of hints of color here and there, but overall it's focused on the value. You have some highlights here to really anchor the readability here as well and have a little more of a range. But you can see that the highlights in this part are toned down so that you don't go all the way here. If you get a lighter value and do this, the eye will probably go this way because of contrast. So it comes down to composition as well, and value as a way of guiding the eye. Also, the color highlights that we see in some of the places will call the attention because they're different. So we'll get that to that in a video about composition. If that's out already, it's going to be in a playlist about tutorial guides. So I hope this was useful, and really go one step at a time. There's nothing to lose here. You will get more complex scenes or go into figures and definitely help control your values later on. That's something that I really struggle a lot to this day. So I really admire all the people that get to these amazing results, and I hope you all do as well. So yeah, have a great one, and I hope to see you all in another video. Take care.